The engines of Air Force One roared across the runway in Beijing as President Donald Trump prepared to leave China after one of the most tense diplomatic summits of his presidency. Cameras flashed. Security convoys moved rapidly across the airport. Chinese officials stood carefully in formation while global media networks broadcast every second live around the world. But despite the ceremonial atmosphere, something had changed dramatically during the summit. The mood surrounding Trump's departure no longer felt diplomatic. It felt dangerous. Because only hours before boarding the aircraft, Trump delivered a chilling warning about Iran that instantly sent shockwaves through governments, military command centers, and financial markets worldwide. Standing before reporters after his final meetings with Xi Jinping, Trump warned that Tehran must make a deal or face consequences bigger than before. Reuters.com. The statement immediately overshadowed everything else accomplished during the Beijing summit. Trade discussions suddenly mattered less. Diplomatic smiles disappeared from headlines. And across the world, one terrifying question began spreading rapidly: was America preparing for another military escalation against Iran? The timing of Trump's warning made the situation even more alarming. The summit with Xi Jinping had already taken place under the shadow of rising Middle East tensions. Oil markets remained unstable due to threats surrounding the Strait of Hormuz. Military forces across the Gulf stayed on high alert. Israel continued increasing pressure against Iranian-backed groups regionally. And behind closed doors, diplomats feared the fragile ceasefire surrounding the Iran crisis was already beginning to collapse. Many world leaders had hoped Trump's meetings with Xi could help stabilize the situation. Instead, the summit appeared to end with even greater uncertainty than before. Financial markets reacted nervously almost immediately after Trump's comments. Oil prices surged as investors feared the possibility of renewed military operations near the Gulf. Reuters.com. Shipping companies reviewed security risks around Hormuz again. Stock markets turned volatile as analysts warned prolonged instability could damage global economic recovery efforts already weakened by inflation and geopolitical tension. Businesses worldwide understood what military planners already feared: even one major escalation involving Iran could disrupt energy supplies, shipping routes, and financial confidence globally within days. Inside Beijing, Chinese officials responded carefully and cautiously. Xi Jinping publicly emphasized stability, dialogue, and peaceful resolution while avoiding direct confrontation with Trump's warning. But reports suggested Chinese leadership privately viewed the situation with growing concern. China depended heavily on Middle Eastern energy supplies, and prolonged instability around Hormuz threatened Chinese economic growth directly. Beijing wanted the summit to project global stability and responsible diplomacy. Instead, Trump's final warning transformed the summit into a symbol of rising geopolitical danger. Chinese officials reportedly feared that if military escalation resumed after Trump's departure, global markets could face severe disruption while relations between Washington and Beijing became even more fragile. Yet Trump's supporters argued the warning was intentional strategic pressure rather than preparation for immediate war. According to White House officials, the president believed Iran only responded seriously under maximum pressure. Trump wanted Tehran to understand that Washington's patience was ending quickly. He also wanted China to recognize that America expected stronger action from Beijing regarding Iranian behavior. In Trump's view, economic pressure, military deterrence, and unpredictability created leverage necessary to force negotiations forward. But critics warned that the strategy carried enormous risks. In highly tense geopolitical environments, threats can easily trigger miscalculation instead of compromise. And with military forces already operating dangerously close across the Gulf region, even rhetorical escalation could increase chances of confrontation dramatically. The Strait of Hormuz became the center of global anxiety once again after Trump's statement. Nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through those waters every day, making Hormuz one of the most critical economic choke points on Earth. Iranian threats surrounding shipping routes had already shaken energy markets repeatedly throughout the crisis. Trump's warning increased fears that the United States might expand military operations if Tehran continued resisting demands related to shipping security and nuclear negotiations. Analysts warned that any direct confrontation inside Hormuz could trigger immediate global economic consequences: rising fuel prices, inflation shocks, shipping disruptions. The phrase, "consequences bigger than before," raised immediate speculation about what options Washington might actually be considering. Expanded naval operations? Airstrikes? Cyber attacks? Stronger sanctions? Nobody fully knew. That uncertainty itself became destabilizing. Iranian military commanders responded by increasing readiness levels while warning that Tehran would retaliate aggressively against any future attacks. State media in Iran described Trump's comments as proof that America remained committed to intimidation rather than diplomacy. Al-Jazeera.com, the deeper concern surrounding Trump's warning involved what it revealed about the broader global situation. The Beijing summit was originally supposed to focus heavily on stabilizing relations between the United States and China after years of trade wars, sanctions battles, and technology rivalry. But by the end of the summit, Iran had overshadowed everything. The Middle East crisis now connected directly to U.S.-China relations, global oil markets, military strategy, artificial intelligence competition, and the future balance of global power itself. Every issue was becoming interconnected. Every crisis influenced another. And world leaders increasingly struggled to separate diplomacy from confrontation in an environment where trust between major powers kept collapsing. As Air Force One lifted into the gray Beijing sky and Trump departed China, the world remained trapped between fragile diplomacy and growing fear. Investors watched markets nervously. Governments prepared contingency plans. Military forces stayed alert across the Gulf. And ordinary people around the world could only wait, wondering whether Trump's warning represented another pressure tactic designed to force negotiations, or the first signal that a much larger conflict was moving closer than anyone wanted to admit publicly. Because after the Beijing summit ended, one reality became impossible to ignore. The world was no longer asking whether the Iran crisis could destabilize global politics. It already had. The only remaining question was how much worse things could still become from here, behind the towering red walls of Beijing's Zongnanhai compound, far away from reporters and television cameras. President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping sat through some of the most sensitive negotiations of the year. Publicly, the summit looked calm and controlled. Leaders smiled for photographs. Diplomats praised constructive dialogue. State media on both sides emphasized cooperation and stability. But inside the private meeting rooms, the atmosphere was far more tense. Because after Trump's chilling war warning toward Iran, the summit suddenly transformed into an emergency geopolitical negotiation over a crisis threatening to destabilize the entire world economy. And at the center of those secret talks stood one critical issue: Iran. Trump entered the meetings determined to pressure China into taking a harder position against Tehran. The White House believed Beijing possessed enormous leverage over Iran because China remained Tehran's largest economic partner and biggest oil customer. American officials understood something simple but extremely important: without Chinese cooperation, isolating Iran economically would become nearly impossible. That gave Xi Jinping huge influence during the summit. Trump reportedly pushed Xi repeatedly to pressure Tehran into reopening the Strait of Hormuz, reducing military tensions, and accepting stronger limits on its nuclear program. Turn Zero News 24, according to White House officials, Trump also demanded that China stop quietly helping Iran survive Western pressure economically. The president believed Beijing was publicly calling for peace while privately protecting Tehran from the full impact of sanctions and international isolation. Xi Jinping's position, however, was far more complicated than Washington wanted to admit publicly. China depended heavily on Middle Eastern energy supplies, and Iranian oil remained extremely important for China's long-term economic security. At the same time, Xi understood that prolonged war near the Gulf threatened China's economy badly. Rising oil prices, unstable shipping routes, and disruption around Hormuz could damage global trade and Chinese manufacturing growth severely. Beijing wanted stability desperately. But she also refused to appear weak or subordinate to American demands during such a high-profile summit. This created a delicate balancing act throughout the negotiations. China wanted the Strait of Hormuz reopened and global energy markets stabilized. Yet Beijing also wanted to preserve strategic ties with Iran while avoiding the appearance of joining an American pressure campaign openly. Reports from the summit suggested Trump and Xi reached at least one area of agreement privately: Iran should never obtain nuclear weapons. Trump later told reporters that both leaders agreed completely on that point. But beneath those public statements, mistrust remained everywhere. Trump reportedly became frustrated during private discussions because she refused to publicly threaten Tehran or fully support Washington's maximum pressure strategy. Chinese officials emphasized diplomacy, ceasefires, and negotiations instead of stronger punishment. Beijing repeatedly warned against militarization of the strait and opposed actions that could push the region toward wider war. Turn 0 Search 4. From Xi's perspective, America's aggressive military posture risked creating the very economic disaster both countries wanted to avoid. But Trump viewed caution differently. He believed Tehran only responded seriously when facing overwhelming pressure. According to officials familiar with the talks, Trump warned Xi that continued Iranian resistance would force Washington to consider larger consequences if diplomacy failed completely. That warning reportedly increased tension inside the meetings because Beijing feared renewed American military operations could destabilize the entire region further. China's leadership worried another escalation would send oil prices soaring while damaging already fragile global markets. Turn 0 News 26. At the same time, Xi also feared Washington might use the Iran crisis strategically to strengthen American military influence across Asia and the Middle East simultaneously. The deeper the negotiations went, the clearer one reality became: the Iran crisis was no longer simply about Iran anymore. It had become deeply connected to the broader rivalry between Washington and Beijing themselves. Every discussion about oil linked to trade tensions. Every debate about Hormuz connected to military strategy. Every conversation about nuclear weapons connected to global power politics. The summit exposed how interconnected modern geopolitics had become. Even while discussing Iran, Trump and Xi still faced growing tensions over Taiwan, artificial intelligence, semiconductor restrictions, military alliances, and the future balance of global power itself. Reports suggested Trump privately pressed Xi to use China's economic influence more aggressively against Tehran behind the scenes. Beijing resisted making major public commitments but quietly signaled support for keeping Hormuz open and avoiding nuclear escalation. Turn 0 Search 19. Analysts described the outcome as a fragile diplomatic compromise, enough cooperation to calm markets temporarily, but far from genuine strategic trust between both powers. And that mistrust became the summit's most important hidden story. Trump increasingly viewed China as both a rival and a necessary partner at the exact same time. She increasingly viewed America as unstable, aggressive, but still too powerful to confront directly. Both leaders needed each other economically while simultaneously competing for global influence politically and militarily. The Iran crisis only intensified those contradictions further. As negotiations stretched late into the night inside Zhongnanhai, the world waited nervously for signs of progress. Publicly, both governments emphasized cooperation and diplomacy. But privately, neither Washington nor Beijing fully trusted the other's long-term intentions. And that is what made the summit so fragile. Because even while Trump and Xi searched for ways to prevent wider war with Iran, the deeper geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China continued growing beneath every diplomatic handshake and carefully worded statement. The streets of Tehran were filled with tension long before Donald Trump boarded Air Force One and issued his latest warning to Iran. Sirens echoed through parts of the capital. Military convoys moved across highways at night. State television broadcast speeches about resistance and national survival while crowds gathered waving Iranian flags and chanting against America and Israel. But despite rising military pressure, economic sanctions, and global isolation, one thing became increasingly clear during the crisis: Iran was not backing down. In fact, after Trump's latest threats following the China summit, Tehran appeared more determined than ever to resist American demands, even if that resistance pushed the Middle East closer to another dangerous confrontation. Iranian leaders rejected Washington's pressure almost immediately after Trump's warning spread across global headlines. Officials in Tehran accused the United States of trying to force surrender rather than negotiate peace seriously. Foreign Minister Abbas Araki declared publicly that Iran had no trust in Washington and would only negotiate if the United States showed genuine commitment to diplomacy instead of threats. Turn 0 Search 1. The message coming from Tehran was blunt and consistent: Iran would not abandon its nuclear research, strategic influence, or regional position simply because America demanded it.